Hello.
Our story begins within a disturbance in the Force, a wailing that felt like an echo being trapped in a perpetual loop of suffering. Agony, suffering, and the feast of death, all of which being hallmarks of a wound in the Force being created. Darth Maul knew of legends, Sith tales meant to encourage young members to keep the path and seek everlasting power. Following Order 66, he thought nothing could eclipse that pain. The Jedi Order was wiped out in a matter of hours. The remaining 10,000 members from the Clone Wars were hunted down and defeated by their own men, a brilliant masterstroke even in Maul's mind. He believed his master's work was truly remarkable, but with Maul knowing of the completion of Order 66, he pondered what else it could be. Inside of his Republic shuttle, deep in the middle of nowhere, he closed his eyes and searched for it. The echo he heard was the exact same thing Sidious felt following his encounter with the Grand Master of the Jedi Order. It was a premonition of what had been set in stone, as all is as the Force wills it. This was the destiny of the Chosen One, for having been corrupted, a path down darkness meant to end in balance. It would all begin with a loss that hadn't occurred yet, and therefore Maul, who could feel the fueled hatred, decided to find his output. With his eyes sealed shut, he saw lava rivers. Darkness emanated from the planet, supernatural beings hitting caverns around the towers of volcanic ash. He could sense burning and feel the vibrant heat of such a planet. There were few worlds that had this, and Maul knew that among them, there had to be one that he knew of. If this was indeed some sort of great suffering, one incurred by a singular individual, as it felt it was, then perhaps it was someone like Sidious. He hoped that if he could find this source, he could find a nearly killed Palpatine and finish the job. The satisfaction in killing someone like Sidious was immeasurable. He could finally have his revenge and take over the Emperor's empire. It would be a true changing of the guard, the rightful position any student of a Sith Lord should have. He pulled up coordinates on the shuttle, and siphoned through planets that all had a lava-based environment on them. He closed his eyes again and Maul allowed the Force to be his guide. Then he found it, Mustafar. He pulled his ship around and shoved the hyperdrive in. When the Sith warrior arrived, he sped through the atmosphere of the planet. The black clouds were thick, but they also allowed Maul to hide from another rival who was walking away from Anakin's body. Obi-Wan had just defeated his apprentice, and instead of ensuring the kill, he was walking away with Skywalker's saber in hand. He needed to get Padme to a medical facility, so he wasn't concerned with ensuring someone's death. It was all but likely, considering no one else was here on Mustafar to save him. Maul landed under the cover of darkness, allowing it to cloud his landing procedure. When he walked out, he could see a shiny Naboo starship lift off into the air and away from a facility on the other side of the river. How peculiar. His metallic legs carried him across the ash and soot, until he stepped to the edge of a lava bank. He could hear screaming, and it brought him to the sight that left even Maul a little sick to his stomach. A body burning, one missing 3 of 4 important limbs, and shedding agony. At this point, the former Sith apprentice realized that he had sensed a premonition. This individual's suffering was set in stone by the Force, therefore he was destined to be discovered in such a state of destruction. Maul slid down, reaching his hand out and searching for an identity. It was someone he had never encountered personally, perhaps running by, but not actually interacting with. When he reached the body, he used the Force to stop the fires from burning, only to realize that the individual he tried to bring to Mandalore was right beneath his hands. Sidious's prized student had failed, and therefore was left to suffer. Whether it was by Palpatine's own hand or another's, he was unsure, but what Maul did know was what he had before him was an advantage. If he could secure Skywalker's soul and a life debt, then perhaps he could destroy his master and forge a new empire in his own name. So as a means to preserve life, he placed his hand on Skywalker's chest, and spoke in Dathomiri tongues. From his hand emanated green mist, similar in fashion to what his very mother used before her untimely death. Darth Maul didn't know much of their ways, and he wished he had learned more, but following Savage's death, he picked up a little more information before the complete collapse of their ancient society. Mother Talzin, after all, wasn't killed by Grievous, but by Mace Windu. This extra time in her life allowed Maul to learn the power to seal open wounds. While Mother Talzin's information wouldn't completely heal Anakin's body, Maul had enough knowledge from his short stint to save a piece of Skywalker. He only had mere minutes to learn from his mother, so this would have to suffice until some medical professionals within Crimson Dawn could fix Anakin up. As Maul planted his hands on Anakin's chest, the proclaimed Jedi Chosen One realized that Obi-Wan wasn't here. He thought that his master had come back to finish him off. He looked into Maul's piercing eyes and screamed even more. Maul looked down with a hint of agitation and asked Anakin if he was done yet. Skywalker squeezed out a few words, and despite his current condition, demanded to know what Maul wanted with him. The leader of Crimson Dawn shoved his hand on Anakin's chest and rolled him over, not softly. He told Anakin that he would serve him. Before Maul could finish, Skywalker or Vader or whatever he had become yelled out, requesting that Maul let him die. The former Sith apprentice just smiled. He wouldn't be going that easily. He had much larger foes to tackle, and they would do it together. In exchange for his services, Maul promised to allow Skywalker freedom. If he refused to serve him and listen to his direction, then he would be killed, and whoever else he loved would suffer for his foolishness. After all, he didn't want Ahsoka to be resurrected from the dead, only to face his wrath once more. Anakin squirmed and yelled, telling Maul that he would die. Maul's open hand palmed Skywalker's neck, and he looked deep into his eyes, telling him to silence himself. He was concentrating. This obviously didn't work, but Maul was able to use the Dathomiri magic to heal Anakin's lungs specifically, in hopes that it would save his life. The fallen Jedi wasn't healed like a Jedi Force heal would. The Night Sister magic heal tied together open strands. It was similar to sewing a ripped article of clothing. It would never be back to full operation, but it was enough. Anakin, now forever imbued with magic that had been passed down for generations. When Skywalker woke up, hours, maybe even days had gone by. He was in a chamber, one that he did not recognize. Maul's voice could be heard, but he couldn't be seen. However, something was clear to Anakin. His lungs were breathable. One thing he did remember before he saw darkness was the fact that he struggled immensely to breathe. Now he could, and now he could feel his limbs. His head tilted over and looked at a new robotic arm on his body, and he could see the glimmer of metallic legs too. Anakin raised himself up slowly. He wasn't wearing much clothing, thus revealing his extensive burns to his chest, shoulders, and stomach. He turned to his right and pulled an electrostaff into his hands and leapt off the medical table, igniting the staff and shoving it into the abdomen of the inept guard, stationed to watch over him. Just as Vader turned back, his yellow eyes met Maul's. He asked Anakin if this is how he repaid people for saving his life. Vader's face tightened, telling Maul that he elongated his suffering, and the Syndicate leader smiled, telling Anakin that he hadn't seen true suffering yet. Only 1,000 seconds of burning before he was found. Merely 1,000 more of being awake before being put to rest. His suffering was mitigated by his kindness. If he wished to feel true suffering, then the strands holding his lungs together could be removed. Anakin rushed at Maul, seeing this as a threat, not a warning. The former Sith stepped back, pulling his saber off of his belt and igniting it. He blocked a couple strikes, but Anakin was very weak, despite the medical treatment he was given. Maul shoved his fist into Anakin's sternum before breaking through the electrostaff that he was using. Maul's saber was then flung with the base into Anakin's nose. The crack could be heard across the starship as Anakin wheezed in pain and fell over. Maul planted his hand firmly on Anakin's shoulder and twisted. The burnt skin ripped and tore under Maul's very flesh, as he told Skywalker that his survival was a gift. He could have faced much harder trials. Blood littered the floor and Anakin's new arms. Maul released his grip and told Anakin that this was a second chance at a life he had squandered away in service to Sidious. He was always a part of the plan and too ignorant to see it. If he wished to be difficult, then he would see the airlock. If he decided that he wished to be a partner in this, then perhaps they could get along. Maul picked Anakin up and helped him over to the medical table, and leaned the device up so that Anakin could sit instead of lay. The medical droid came over to tend to Anakin's torn skin and broken nose. Maul's hands found themselves at his back, and he abandoned the room, towards the bridge where hyperspace lanes were speeding towards them. In the coming hours, they would arrive at a lush world with rock formations and scattered trees, all of which being covered in a dense green. The planet was called Leacor, and it was one of the first situational bases for Crimson Dawn and the Shadow Collective. The criminal syndicate hadn't fully agreed on planting themselves on the system or not, so for now, it was a temporary fort. Maul was speaking with Dryden Voss in person by the time Skywalker came to, again. They were discussing output locations and credit influx. These included spice trade, slave options, and even racketeering strikes. As they were speaking, Anakin spoke up. Maul turned back, grinning, before informing Dryden that this was his new asset. He asked Skywalker what it was that he wanted to say. Skywalker pursed his lips and crossed his arms in a torn garment. He told Maul that if he wanted to be allies, there'd be no slave trade in this alliance. Maul took a deep breath and told Anakin that this was a criminal syndicate, one just starting up, and due to losing Mandalore, they couldn't take advantage of a strong spaceport to build off of. They were behind the other major organizations by a long shot, and if they had any hope of destroying the Emperor, then they needed credits. If he perhaps had any better ideas, he'd be willing to hear Anakin out. Skywalker stood motionless as Maul turned away from him to continue speaking with Dryden. As this happened, Anakin realized something. He couldn't continue without a suit. His skin was shredded. His body was out in the open. The sun, even on a cloudy day, was sizzling his skin. The slight breeze that rolled through the rocks sent shivers down his entire body. If he wanted to have any chance at being useful, he needed a suit to protect himself, and more than that, a mask to cover his head. He turned away and hid in the shadows as he waited for Maul to return to him. Anakin needed help with his body. As he waited, he thought about how he could contribute to Crimson Dawn, so that they could stop the slave trade. This was perhaps the last remaining piece of Anakin Skywalker, aside from hope that Padme was still alive. But he couldn't sense her, so she had either died in childbirth or from his hand. Or, of course, the Jedi were cloaking her presence. Regardless of what it was, he was left holding on to small tidbits of himself. Vader was present now, but he at this current moment wasn't strong enough to challenge Maul. He wasn't even used to these new limbs, and his body was unprotected and fragile, even with the tunic he was wearing. When Maul was finished, Anakin suggested they start knocking off Imperial transports, and it was revealed that Crimson Dawn didn't have the funding to do that, nor the necessary training to fully optimize those raids. If they acted now, then the Imperial regime would tighten their security, making it impossible for them to get a foot in. In the coming weeks to months, Crimson Dawn would react to actions placed forth by the Empire. What Sidious would do would be much different than what Palpatine did, and they needed to anticipate, but patiently react. These were lessons Skywalker would come to learn as they worked together. This offended Anakin, but he couldn't say anything to rebuke it because Maul was right in a sense. However, thanks to what Skywalker said about his body, Maul remembered something from long before. It was something he hadn't considered because his pride wouldn't let him. To clarify, Maul's Zabrak warrior pride prevented him from wanting to use the Force in combat. He wanted to win a straight fight, to prove that he was the better warrior overall. So when Anakin expressed weaknesses in his body and his need for protective robes and a mask, Maul remembered something from his adolescence. Plagueis the Wise had once told him of a place to go, to protect himself if either of them had died. This was an assurance to prevent a Sith extinction. Baldemic inside the Auril sector of the Outer Rim territories. Maul happened to remember the name of the planet, because it was so obscure, but where it was located, he was unsure. The chances are they wouldn't find it on a star map, because the Sith used it as a hidden location at one point. He told Skywalker that he would outfit him with a suit to protect his skin, and a helmet, but if they could find that location, then he could assure him power and protection not seen by the likes of anyone for decades. He hoped that Sidious was not privy to the location of the planet, but if he didn't know, then they could forge a perfect path towards Crimson Dawn domination from there. Until they could locate the hidden planet of Baldemic, Anakin and Maul would work on their relationship. It would be here where Maul confessed Ahsoka's true fate. He didn't know it. While he would have preferred to keep Vader perpetually angry, it was too much of an unnecessary risk. He could snap at any moment, and Maul had no desire to be on the receiving end of it. This kept Anakin off of him, and allowed the two of them to work as allies for the time being. Skywalker had absolute aspirations of killing Maul, but there was revenge to be had. Sidious and Kenobi had betrayed both of them. Despite being raised and trained through two different lifestyles, the results were oddly similar. Sidious had forgotten them, and Obi-Wan had mutilated them. Their lust for revenge was ever-consuming, and after having seen Padme's funeral, which was a live-aired event, Anakin knew it was time to stop hoping that he could return to her. However she died was a result of his actions, and whether that was his failure to save her, or his forced choke on Mustafar, he didn't know. But it did determine the placement of his anger. Some of it was self-blamed. Some was outwards towards institutions like the Jedi or the Sith, and the rest was projected on individuals who failed her, like Sidious, Yoda, and Obi-Wan. Though at the end of all of it, it was Maul who was by his side, and encouraging him to work through the pain. The two of them, after several months of searching, were able to find the Baldemic planet that Plagueis the Wise had told Maul about. It was there where they forged Anakin a cortosis mask. They used his disadvantages as placements to make him stronger. His forearms were coated lightly with the dense metal, and the helmet he had been wearing was plunged into its liquid form and dried, before it was repainted. Skywalker was menacing, not just with a new mask, but with a new saber. Maul had taken on an instructor role with Anakin, and it led to him killing a Jedi Temple guard, who presented a crossguard lightsaber. It was during this kill that Anakin tried to bleed the weapon, but failed. The hilt of the weapon was actually fine, but the crystal inside was bled by an unstable individual. Anakin, despite feeling rage over the loss of his wife, felt even more confused because of his trajectory with Maul. His rage was overshadowed by regret, and therefore, it was impossible to fully bend the crystal to its will. Anakin and Vader didn't want to fully bend either, and a major part of that was the difference between Maul and Sidious. Without having to use life support, a voice modulator, and have a tube shoved down his throat all the time, he was able to relax, let go of the darkness. His metallic limbs were comfortable, not overbearing and impossible to use. Anakin's life was relatively peaceful as a result. He functioned as an asset of Crimson Dawn, working to make sure the criminal syndicate could weed out slave labor, which did work. Instead of Sidious as a master, he had Maul as a brother. That's what the former Sith Zabrak wanted as was. He was the teacher and he had the quote-unquote power, but above all else, he was searching for connection. Anakin replaced Savage, and from that replacement, they both gained brotherhood. The forging of the cortosis mask and forearm covers were just a step in the right direction. Due to the disappearance, or what Sidious believed was the death of Skywalker, the Sith and Empire needed enforcers. The Inquisitors had to be trained by the Emperor himself, and he was forced to train them to their full potential. Without it, the Jedi could return with a vengeance. This led to Maul and Vader interacting with the Inquisitors on a few occasions, but none of it led to Sidious finding out who was behind it, because there were no witnesses. The Inquisitors traveled in duos, and no one was a match for Maul or a recovering Skywalker. On the other side of interactions with the Empire, Anakin had come up with a chance to take control over a new Imperial initiative placed by Vice Admiral Rampart. The Empire forced every citizen to use chain codes, and so, with some genius ingenuity, Anakin and a few other pirates from the Syndicate were able to siphon money away from upper-class people into their hands. This wasn't some Robin Hood BS. This was criminals stealing money to fund more crimes. The Empire wasn't able to stop it, because to everyone, it looked like they were stealing the money from the upper class. It wouldn't be picked up by a news station because Sidious controlled the media, but through word of mouth, people were learning that others were losing money through chain codes. The reason this wasn't reported was because the Empire couldn't prove that the chain codes were being stolen by pirates or criminals. It just looked like the Empire was stealing the credits and using it for themselves. This gave Crimson Dawn more leeway financially, and therefore the chance to stop using slave labor, though there was something else that aided with this labor issue. Due to the Empire losing out on a critical enforcer in Vader, and Sidious genuinely taking his time to try and find Anakin, the Empire got to the battleships of the CIS Reserve Fleet later. This gave Anakin, an individual who gave the shutdown command to the entire droid army, a chance to relocate it. A majority of these forces had been destroyed by the clones, but Sidious had lost time, and in that lost time, Crimson Dawn seized an opportunity. They now had an official navy, one that was tiny in comparison to the Empire, but it was even more prepared militaristically than any other navy owned by any other syndicate. With Crimson Dawn's position in the Outer Rim as a group that kind of unified the other syndicates, they couldn't really start a conflict with any one of them. Yet, the larger ones were secured allies, so there was real potential for the smaller groups to be targeted. There were hundreds of miniature cartels, kingpins, pirate guilds, and so forth that had territory worth taking. Everyone had to eat, and if Crimson Dawn could secure more profit for themselves, then more would be willing to join them. Maul's aspirations were for a grander criminal network that could challenge Palpatine. If they didn't secure the core, then fine. If they didn't capture Kuwata Coruscant, then fine, but by the Force, they were going to make sure Sidious died an elongated and painful death. He deserved to suffer for what they had been put through. After a full year or so of working together, Anakin and Maul were truly connected as brothers. What started as vengeance on Palpatine and lust for revenge on Maul transformed into a true brotherhood. It was ironic. Maul had only the intention to use Skywalker as a tool, but as they spent more time together, they realized that their bond was much more important. Through training and battle, or silence and congregation, the two, connected by fate, were driven to be each other's biggest motivators. When they trained, they honed their skills. They excessively challenged the other to be a better competitor. Whether it was Skywalker or Maul who lost the spar, they found room to improve on both ends. They were truly a remarkable duo, because every day was a step forward, and as Anakin healed from his wounds on Mustafar, he became more imbued with skills equatable to what he should be as the Chosen One. Anakin's growth wasn't just inspiration for the future, it was a true certification that they could change the galaxy together. Crimson Dawn was the growing empire, and like the Jedi of old, the criminal syndicates around the Outer Rim were complacent. Their empire was the one with direction and inspired to change the future for themselves. While the Hutt's Black Suns and Pike Syndicate waited idly in their power, hoping to have higher returns annually, Crimson Dawn challenged the mighty empire. With two duelists capable of fighting off enforcers, it was much easier for them anyways. Though, with a full year having gone by, something became more apparent. Sidious was impatient. Actions mandated by the Imperial Senate and by the Emperor's office proved that he was frustrated. Inquisitors were dying every other month, and the threat of the Jedi was continuously growing. There were 100 or so unaccounted for Jedi after Order 66, and following a year of inquisitorious action, the number was down to a remarkable 85 or so. The numbers fluctuated frequently, but the Jedi had time to rally together and multiply. Sidious was actually hoping that Maul could become his lead enforcer, but he too was impossible to locate. This was semi-ironic, due to the nature of Crimson Dawn's criminal activities. Maul preferred to be on his throne, mostly on Dathomir, but he never was, because Anakin kept him in the flow. The two of them, separately usually, went to Imperial outposts and raided everything. Crimson Dawn would steal technology, free prisoners and slaves, as well as kill off Imperial personnel, so Sidious's hopes were actually directly in front of him all the time. The Empire had huge recruitment numbers after Order 66, but they stagnated with outlying attacks across the expansion territory. Crimson Dawn was unstoppable in these raids, and very infrequently were there survivors of these attacks. Due to the criminal empire freeing slaves, especially with the employment of retrofitted Clone War battle droids, Crimson Dawn saw their own recruitment numbers soar. People were willing to serve thanks in part to the humanity they were shown by the Syndicate. Many of these people had been passed around between the other dynasties, so to have one that actually valued their humanity or sentience was a breath of fresh air to them, thus bringing in their loyalty. These Crimson Dawns became more common, and thus, Sidious brought all of his Inquisitors back to Coruscant so that he could complete their training. The issue is, due to the attacks themselves and reported rebel activity from insurgents like Saw Gerrera, Sidious was left to assume that the Jedi had formed a coalition of rebels. Crimson Dawn was a concern of the outer edges of Imperial territory, but based on trends and statistics, criminal syndicates left the Republic alone. Why would they target a more powerful empire, one that could militaristically wipe all of them off the map? So in full belief that the Jedi were behind these attacks, Sidious prepared to exterminate these foes once and for all. The last of the clone army was sent to the Outer Rim, to be expendable, as the new TK stormtroopers were filled into Imperial bases across the Mid and Inner Rim. The Inquisitors would be prepared to stop this rising movement. One attribute that Maul particularly liked about Crimson Dawn, as he retrofitted his brotherhood with Anakin, was the militaristic side. He hoped that by uniting the other syndicates he might militarize enough to challenge the ruling galactic powers. But following Mandalore, he realized he needed more. If the Mandalorians could be sent running by a couple clones and a failed Jedi prospect, then perhaps he needed more able-bodied soldiers. Sure, it was a negligent perspective of the events during the siege, but he saw failure, therefore, no reason to continue it. And the main reason Crimson Dawn had so much success against the Empire was due to Anakin and himself being present, something he wouldn't have discovered without Anakin being by his side and encouraging him to go into combat on the front lines. The battleships of the CIS Navy were also a step in the right direction, because despite being commanded by Sentients loyal to, hired, or employed by the Syndicate, they were able to capture decommissioned vessels from the Republic Navy. This wasn't a major concern to Imperial officials, because they assumed that these ships were being stolen for scrap metal, but it was also something Palpatine didn't know about. Thanks to Anakin's desire to set up racketeering within Imperial lines, most officers who reported to local Moffs in the Outer Rim territories were paid off, so they gave very basic and unfulfilling data reports to their superiors. No Moff knew about stolen Venators or Acclimators, and because all worker affairs went through the same offices as these paid-off officers, there was nowhere for the information to go. It sat on desks, collected dust, and was completely forgotten about. And even funnier, with a larger navy, Crimson Dawn didn't have the personnel to fill the bridges of any of these vessels, let alone fully crew any number of them, but they had a navy that could be used when they had the personnel. That was the benefit also of the Separatist Navy. Most of the controls were designed to be interconnected and self-operated, so if the sentient crew and/or captain lost control of the operating droids, they could take control over the ship without much of a problem if they had 3 or 4 sentient people on board. This afforded Crimson Dawn a massive navy that could be used if they had more manpower. Regardless of how positive things seemed for Anakin as a joint leader of a criminal organization, he still held deep resentment for Obi-Wan. He couldn't forgive him because every time Maul spoke, he wished death upon that man. It was one of the anchoring similarities between the two of them, and it was the irony of having a criminal organization based in the Outer Rim. Anakin had been on Tatooine a number of times, but he never heard or saw an Obi-Wan Kenobi. He considered visiting the Lars, but they had only brought him pain. No need to open old scars, in his opinion. It was at this point, 2.5 years following the fall of the Republic, that Maul wanted to make a move. He had realized that Crimson Dawn's aspirations would never come from direct war with the Empire. The only way they could find more power was in conquering the Outer Rim. With full control over it, they might have a chance at actually building a military force, so instead of going directly to war, they would catch Sidious off guard and go from there. He told Anakin that they could kill Sidious and watch the Imperial structure cave in on itself. Once Palpatine was dead, they could expand across the Outer Rim and watch the Empire implode from a distance. Perhaps once that was finished, they could have enough manpower to strike the Imperial regime. It was a valid idea. Crimson Dawn had amassed a sizable navy, including several Clone War era vessels, and their military force was the largest of the other major syndicates. Without slave labor and freeing those who were once slaves, a large coalition of loyalists formed around the criminal organization, as battle droids did the slave labor. Thanks in part to the Imperial officers on their payroll, Maul and Anakin had a secured passage to find Sidious at any given time. As it turned out, he was commemorating the creation of a new super base out by Naboo. It was the first of its kind, and it was meant to deter these attacks from happening. Sidious chose near Naboo to appease the people of his homeworld, which that did work. This of course also helped him fund a larger military. Thousands of TK stormtroopers were gathered up for this, and at the landing pad was Darth Sidious, guarded by his 6 royal guards. The Imperial officer who got transport to Maul and Anakin was paid very well. As per their plans, they waited for the Dark Lord to actually make it into the base, where he was meant to hold a presser for the people of the galaxy to see, proof that the Empire was stronger than the Republic, and so on and so forth. Maul and Anakin hid within the complex, and waited to spring their trap. This would be Dawn's first true strength against the Empire. With 3 Imperial 1-star destroyers in orbit, they'd be tasked with destroying the fleet and penetrating the base, while their leaders killed a Sith Lord. What they didn't know was that Grand Inquisitor and his 9th sister were also here. They were the most powerful of the Inquisitors, guarding their Emperor. Once Maul and Anakin had Sidious in a trap, they locked the entire facility down, cutting all of its power off after booby-trapping the Sith Lord. Sidious once again believed Jedi, and activated the 2 Inquisitors. Despite having the jump on Palpatine, Anakin and Maul were completely blindsided by the 9th Sister and Grand Inquisitor. 4 Crimson Sabers dropped down, Maul shoved Anakin to the side and rolled away, igniting his staff and thrusting forward at Grand Inquisitor. The hulking Ninth Sister charged at Anakin, who rolled to the side, igniting his cross guard. He defended the strike that launched him backwards. The massive Inquisitor had him playing super defensive until he could find her weak spots. He saw Maul slash forward aggressively as Anakin himself slid across the pristine floors and used the wall as momentum, launching himself back at the sister. She defended herself, and he spun around, clocking her saber and defending another strike. He stepped back, parrying and sliding forward. Her blade hit the side piece of the cross guard, the perfect use of the weapon, but she activated the spin cycle, forcing Anakin to avoid the strike and prepare for another barrage. Maul and Grand Inquisitor were trading blows when he sensed Sidious' arrival to their location. He thrusted the Paul-Un Inquisitor into the wall and grabbed him by the throat, before cutting through the blade he used. Maul turned his attention towards Palpatine's presence. When he saw the cloaked man, he scrunched his face in frustration, before plunging his own saber into Grand Inquisitor. Sidious encouraged him to come alone, but he wouldn't. The fully trained Ninth Sister thought she had Skywalker, but he was just warming up the entire time. A good way to be prepared for Sidious. He slipped her strike and used her own saber to kill her. He shoved the body of the massive creature into the ground before getting by Maul's side. Sidious was right there, lurking, but with a heinous grin. His yellow eyes lighting the corridor, and his hands reached for his sleeves. Sidious spoke delicately but with such intensity that it echoed across the halls. The royal guards activated their pikes, as Sidious told the two former apprentices that staying dead would have saved them their time. The guardsmen rushed forward, and Anakin ripped his hand back towards himself, pulling all of them from their feet and allowing Maul to spin through their bodies, decapitating all six. Brothers stood side by side and readied themselves. Sidious ignited two weapons and slid forward, forcing Anakin and Maul to move to either side of the halls. Above the system, dozens of Clone War-era vessels dropped out of hyperspace. The Imperial fleet, which was facing the star system itself, was completely out of position and had to completely turn around to face the incoming fleet. The Crimson Dawn fighters pressed forward, and their ground troops made a move for the surface. Blaster fire covered the skies over the planet, as Imperial personnel inside the base were informed of the attack. Due to the weakness of the Star Destroyers, the overwhelming fighter attack from the pirate fleet completely disabled their abilities. The few CIS ships and Venators fired away, and raised their shields to protect themselves from the incoming barrage. Inside the base, where explosions rattled the corridors, sabers collided. Anakin and Maul knew that to beat a foe like Sidious, they needed to be at their best. Skywalker shoved forward and Maul did too. Palpatine avoided their strikes and they slammed into one another. Maul saw the equation play out and forced Anakin behind him as he whipped around and defended two strikes from Sidious, lifting his saber above his head. The Sith Lord's weapon bursted and deignited over the weapon. Palpatine looked down with confusion before using his other saber to defend himself. Because with Maul's pride, he couldn't cover his body with any cortosis, but Anakin was able to convince him to put some in the middle of his lightsaber hilt, because it was an easy target, and it would determine life or death for him. It was agreed upon, making the hilt of his saber as indestructible as the Darksaber. He launched himself at Sidious, who moved back angrily, waiting for his other saber to activate again. He defended each strike as former master and apprentices crossed blades across the halls. Anakin got to his feet and rushed down it, using his crossguard as a spear and lobbing it past Maul, who avoided the throw. Palpatine, luckily, pulled back just in time. Anakin leapt up for the saber and slid across the ground, grabbing it and throwing it above his head, catching Sidious' saber in the cross of the hilt, just like he did the Ninth Sister. Maul jumped past Anakin and collided with Sidious as he ignited his second weapon. Their weapons were speedily trading blows, and Maul, festering with anger, knew that this was his chance. Sidious punched Maul in the abdomen and cut across his head, removing one of his horns. Maul wheezed before being electrocuted into the wall. Sidious grinned, and before he could finish off the Zabrak, Anakin lifted him from his feet. Their weapons spun around, defending and striking, each one going for the kill, changing between defense and offense every other second. Sidious found his mark, and as he was going for it, Anakin thrusted his head into the blade of the saber, breaking it apart. Palpatine was shocked by such a jarring move, but he avoided the counter, and just as he wheeled around to kill Skywalker, his blade hit Anakin's forearm, bursting his other saber apart. Anakin gripped Palpatine with a metallic hand, and lobbed his saber into his stomach. Maul looked up and all he could see was Anakin jabbing his weapon again and again and again. Sidious was still alive, feeding off the pain, but he couldn't do anything. His chest had been crushed in on itself, and he was getting stabbed in the abdomen every other second. Anakin shoved Sidious to the ground, and that was an indicator to Maul that he could finish this off, which is what he did. While the brothers wanted to cherish this moment, they had a base to destroy. Dozens of pirate gunships had already landed, completely blindsided the TK troopers on the side of the base. They fired back, but the approaching men and women were starving for another victory. The Imperial troopers didn't have the same drive, and their morale was crushed, seeing that the super base's defenses weren't operating. Maul and Anakin were also cutting through whatever command staff was present inside the base. They took out the command center operation post, and a couple other checkpoints throughout the structure. The best part for them was they were split up. Anakin and Maul didn't need to be around each other for this part, and the TKs were incredibly easy and satisfying to kill. Within hours, the base would be completely taken over, and instead of capturing it, the pirates took the ammunition, the supplies, the credits, and whatever else of value they could find. There were orders to steal TK armor so they could raid more Imperial settlements, which was done per instruction. The death of the Emperor would prove to Anakin and Maul that neither of them wanted to capture Imperial territory. The structure of the Imperial regime crumbled in on itself. The Senate was weak, and with officers holding more power than senators, it was easy for power-obsessed individuals to become aggressive and eventually violent. For Crimson Dawn, this meant an all-out war on the Outer Rim, one that would eventually lead to a very important reunion on Tatooine. Maul had tasked Skywalker with destroying the Hutt Syndicate on Tatooine, because of what they had done to his family, and of course Anakin being from the Dust Bowl. It was Skywalker's chance to close off yet another chapter in his life, as he and Maul moved closer and closer to total Outer Rim dominance. After gutting Jabba, killing his son, and burning the palace to the ground, he roamed the streets, slaughtering slavers as he did. As Anakin walked through those streets, wearing his suit, he saw a familiar face in a crowd of onlookers. It led to him pressing further. Obi-Wan, at this point, was working as a dishwasher in a kitchen. His shift was over, and he stumbled into the sight of the Crimson Dawn posse, imprisoning or killing slavers. Kenobi wouldn't save them, because they didn't deserve it, frankly, but also because he was hiding until the time was right to train Luke. Kenobi made a shifty escape before being caught by Vader. Having already buried his own and Anakin's lightsabers in the sand, Obi-Wan was completely defenseless. Anakin ignited his crimson saber and shoved it towards Kenobi's face, threatening him as he asked if he knew who he was. Obi-Wan truthfully didn't. Having cut himself off from the Force, he couldn't sense the identity, just assuming he was another Inquisitor. Anakin slipped his helmet off of his head and revealed the still scarred and burnt face of the apprentice Kenobi let burn to death on Mustafar. Shock and sadness covered Obi-Wan's face, as trauma whipped its way through his body. He had regretted his actions so much over the past 5 or 6 years, and here they were, facing him. Anakin sensed this and was taken aback, because he believed Obi-Wan's intentions had been malicious. Their rage, their readiness, the determination to kill his former master had dissipated in mere moments. Obi-Wan's eyes watered, as he asked if it was really Anakin, the boy he had trained. Skywalker nodded his head, fearing what came next. This wasn't the same Vader that was pushed into darkness by Sidious. This was a conscious man, living a life of his own choice, serving with another brother on a quest to make the Empire irrelevant, while also adding some positive change to the galaxy. His hate fueled most of his actions, and they almost did, but here they were, for the first time since before Obi-Wan left for Utapau. All those years ago, it was Obi-Wan telling Anakin how proud of him he was, and now it was Kenobi telling Vader something he had spent what felt like a lifetime pondering. He started with a truly heartfelt apology, expressing to Anakin that he was sorry for everything, for allowing him to fall down that path. It was truly the burden of every master to carry their students' faults, and Obi-Wan certainly felt them with Anakin. He told Anakin that he never wanted any of this for him. He only wanted him to have the life he desired, forgetting obvious hints of his secret relationship with Padme, doing what he could to make Ahsoka become his student. All of it was love, and he had hoped that he wouldn't have to kill him on Mustafar. But a part of him had wished that even after Mustafar's events, that they could speak again, so that he could tell Anakin that if he was given a second chance in life, he would have given his life so that Qui-Gon could have instructed him the way that was needed, so that Anakin wouldn't have to suffer the pain he endured in his 23 years of life. These were his failures and his burdens, ones that Anakin wore on his body for no good reason. This left Anakin emotional as he reached for his mask still in his hand and apologized himself. Part of him wanted revenge for so long, and he wanted it because his brother wanted it too. Now he was unsure of what he himself wanted, and thus, his apology to Obi-Wan was for destroying everything his master loved. But Kenobi never blamed him. It had always been his own burden to bear, and he told Anakin to finish what he must. He raised his lightsaber hilt, and before he could ignite it, the weapon slipped from his hand. He told Obi-Wan that he couldn't. The two of them stood apart for several seconds, without a word to be said, and maybe that's how it should be. But slowly they came together to embrace each other. Brothers lost to the wind, finally reunited on the planet where it all started. Obi-Wan considered telling Anakin about Luke, but he couldn't muster the words. They sat stuck in his throat. When they parted, they'd be yet another regret to add to Obi-Wan's list. But that didn't mean father and son would never meet. Eventually they would. But long before that came, much would change. Anakin would never tell Maul of his interaction with Kenobi, and instead confirm that Tatooine was an Obi-Wan-cleared system. Crimson Dawn would become the ruling power on the desert world and across the Outer Rim, but their influence didn't stop at their controlled territory. Following a number of rebellions within the Empire, including a clone trooper uprising and an insurgency for Mandalore, the system Palpatine built around himself would fumble out of control. The power they had wasn't much without its leader, and no matter the politician, they couldn't handle it. The death of the Imperial regime came with coalitions aligning and splitting. What Maul had never been trained became an attribute necessary for the dominant power of the Outer Rim. Because the criminal organization, while stealing and corrupting, wasn't the worst thing in the galaxy. They didn't harbor slaves, and the only infighting came from formerly powerful families and cartels. Aside from that, it was a more peaceful regime than the imperial states that mostly existed in the core. With a powerful military but no structure, the Empire caved and caved, until it was just but a coalition of Coruscant, Corellia, and Chandrilia. It was a fading power, and with the reach of Crimson Dawn established within every single rising collection of systems across the galaxy, they had the chance to establish themselves as an economic powerhouse. Without a care for politics and seeing more purpose in fulfilling his own life, especially after his encounter with Obi-Wan, Anakin decided to step down from Crimson Dawn. This angered Maul greatly, but he was able to relinquish his frustration once Anakin explained that he would always be there for his brother. He just needed more out of his life. Battles and conquests had been a part of his life since the Clone Wars. Maul had the empire he needed. While the former Sith wasn't about making things wholesome, he was understanding, and gave Skywalker as many credits as were needed. Anakin was a Crimson Dawn legend, the enslaver of slavers. People around the Outer Rim would adore him, no matter where he went. Anakin, on this separation from Maul, would eventually find Ahsoka, and their reunion would be a lot less tense than the one with Obi-Wan. In their reunion, they decided that they would stick together, because having your best bud, who was also equatable to having a sibling, around all the time was much better than running solo. The two of them would eventually form their own little crew, not for pirating but for living life. Anakin's credits made traveling and living a lot easier, and they more or less started a great adventure. Anakin continued wearing the gear, but didn't usually wear the helmet, because he liked being seen, especially as he continued to heal. When he met Luke, it was a complete accident, but they eventually learned that they were related, and it led to a blossoming relationship, one not involving the death of the Lars. It'd be a big family, but Anakin would never meet or learn about his daughter, Leia, similar to Anakin never seeing Obi-Wan again. Leia lived a fulfilling life, eventually becoming Chancellor of Hosnian Prime for the Alderaanian Alliance, which consisted of various systems from every rim in the galaxy. Obi-Wan lived a long and happy life on Tatooine, and even contributed to the regrowing sect of the Jedi in the galaxy. This new Jedi Order would never have an issue with Crimson Dawn, because on paper, they weren't cruel to people in the same way either of Palpatine's regimes were. Crimson Dawn would maintain its power, and Maul would eventually consider making a move on former Imperial territory again. But another galactic conflict would deter him from doing it. The empire he built was economically unstoppable, and all the riches in the galaxy with a nice side of revenge against Sidious were more than enough for him. Despite Crimson Dawn being a criminal syndicate, The influence Anakin had on its rejection of enslavement policies led to it being a system better for the galaxy than either the Empire or the Republic. Without a domineering political landscape that shredded any hope of progress, Crimson Dawn representatives worked on behalf of Maul to maintain economic stability and persevering alliances across the galaxy for decades and eventually centuries to come. And that, my friends, is our story. Again, special thanks to all the patrons: Manuel Wells, Ozpin, Angel Dust, Alexander Reese, The Beginning and End, Jack Silver, Prismatic Warlock Master, Lyndall Asher, Smoobs, There Are Cars, Darth Vitiate, Seju Jagger, Groot36, Hunter Belden, Rosebird, General Alexander, Robin Roberts, Blackie Chan, Django Fat Clone, Nick5098, Ben Ingram, The Big Red Puramark, Diamond Constant, Darth Nemesis, Lord Tibbs, CC2024, Galvin Gaming, Tristan, Mandalore, Sir William 1767, Darth Revan, Grandaddy Bane, Laliant, Sky Guy, Penguin, Cullen Rooney, Shark Midori, RJ38, Nick, Michael Erlanger, The Last Jedi, Apollo Weewo 670, Annika Stink Runner, CT7567, Toaster Oven, Oz of Oz, Darth Knox, The Eternal Padawan, Joshua Tem, Johnny DeGuin, Sansa Skeleton, Jedi Sloth, Mr. Yeet Gamer, Lord Calic, Youngling Slayer 66, Man Manu Studios, Anakin 003, Lord Draken, Ford's Legacy Star Wars, Erebus, Rex the Wolf, The Man of Three First Names, Darksing 46, Baron Joshua, and Lord Deadwing. For supporting the channel, smash that like button. Let's talk about this story. So visually, first of all, I don't usually talk about this aspect. Visually, I wanted to use Kylo Ren for the visuals. I felt like it'd be a more fitting look for Anakin. Instead of using Vader, I feel like Vader's suit is a little bit too bulky. The idea of what I'm seeing in my head is more of a Kylo Ren-esque figure with a helmet, wearing more of just robes that are covering and comfortable, not a transformer. As for the story itself, I wanted Maul and Anakin to kind of develop this brotherhood kind of thing. I think that Anakin, as a tactician, would add a lot to Crimson Dawn. I think Maul kind of was obsessed with the idea of just being powerful and sitting on a throne. And that was kind of something I wanted to at least mention in here, is that Anakin gets him off the throne. He's like, hey, stop sitting on the throne, let's go do something. And so a lot of the success that Crimson Dawn has is by actually raiding with their powerhouse players. And Anakin and Maul together, or separated, would be really powerful on the campaign or just doing battles. A lot of the success that Crimson Dawn has isn't through these conflicts. They steal their supplies, obviously, but Crimson Dawn is successful because they're in the pockets of everyone within the Empire, They pay off the little people, and the little people just don't report on things. And that makes them successful, and they obviously racketeer and all that stuff. So that was kind of the fun attribute there. I think Anakin at some point would actually get tired of it. This, more than anything, is like a light version of a Sith. He's not like full dark side, but he's also not like a full light side guy either. I hope you all enjoy the story. I love you all, spread the love, and always remember, my friends, may the Force be with you.